be careful what you tell your brain. You tell your brain you can't do something, it goes, okay, well, I don't have to do that. You've given me an out. And so it uses different neural pathways in terms of activating, what we actually do.
How does a dancer's state of mind actually affect their performance and how they work in the studio?
What we know from psychology is that if you think about an attitude, behavior, results kind of model, is that the thoughts that we have significantly influence the type of emotions and therefore the type of behavior that we engage in. So when our thoughts are what I would call hindering, they're not so helpful, negative, self-talk, that kind of thing, that can really impact upon how we then kind of either are confident or not in executing what we need to do, or that we doubt something, or it might be a particular exercise or piece, or even an approach to how you're approaching your class, in training, that you actually impact upon how you actually go about dancing. And that's why that power of the brain in our thinking is so critical, because it has such an influence, and our thoughts are habitual. So depending upon how we program them, they can either be helpful towards what we're doing or hindering. So, knowing that as human beings, we have great days and not so great days, but that ability to know that if we're really conscious about our frame of mind, the thoughts that we have the ability to change our thinking, which can influence, therefore, the types of feelings that we have and therefore what we actually do.
Just take an example of an exercise, a pirouette exercise, that a dancer is struggling with, and they have in their mind, I can't do this exercise, I'm not good at pirouettes. Yep. How does that actually impact them doing that exercise?
Yeah, I actually have a real life example. I was working with a dancer who had been told by a previous teacher that they weren't a good turner, and had basically, and what we do is we accept or we take on those frames or about ourselves often. And that gets kind of stored in our head, and we keep operating off that. So over a long period of time, this dancer had basically, every time they came to do a pirouette, was kind of already doubting themselves and their ability to do it, but that was reinforced by somebody, in a position of authority that they had respected at the time. And so when they came to execute it, it makes them more anxious. So every time they come to do a pirouette, they're thinking, I'm not a very good turner, I can't do this. And so be careful what you tell your brain. You tell your brain you can't do something, it goes, okay, well, I don't have to do that. You've given me an out. And so it uses different neural pathways in terms of activating, what we actually do. So in that example, we actually worked on identifying, well, where did that original, in my language, frame? So a frame is made up of your thoughts, feelings, and actions, like a picture frame around you, in this instance about the dancer and her pirouettes. So at first she wasn't as conscious about the fact that it actually had been some feedback that she'd actually taken on and internalized. So we actually sat down and mapped out, well, draw a picture of yourself, doing a pirouette, often, working particularly with artists, and they, that visual aspect is more helpful than writing, just words. So we sat down, drew a frame, picture of herself in the middle. Okay, what are those thoughts that you're having about yourself when you think about turning, when you think about doing pirouettes? And sometimes it's not just one thought, it can be multiple thoughts. So from that, it was just like, well, I can't turn, I'm not a turner. Well, then how does that influence? Well, I feel anxious or fearful. I lose my confidence with regards to that. So when I come to do it, when you get anxious, you tense up, so you're automatically not as relaxed or, positioning yourself well to execute a pirouette. So what we did was we identified what that hindering frame was that she'd been operating from. And then we reframed it. So that's from cognitive behavioral therapy. We basically drew a new frame. Again, can't change the picture in the middle. It's her doing a pirouette, but looked at, well, what are other things that are true that you could actually say to yourself? So this is where I was able to challenge her thinking, in that, are there lots of examples where you've done a really good pirouette, or you've pulled off a triple or a quadruple, whatever it might be? And she said, well, yes. Okay. So do you believe that you actually can't turn? So some of that's about challenging those negative thoughts. So we replace them as we reframe that around, well, what's actually true? Well, I can turn, and actually when she does turn, she enjoyed it. So putting that down, that feeling of actually I'm more energized or excited to give it a go because actually I know that I can, and therefore what she did, well, she ended up turning well and she proved that. And then it was about remembering that reframe, so remembering that changed thought, and how does she prompt herself in the middle of class when the old kind of thinking and the old frame comes into play, and she starts to go down that pathway and she goes, hang on a minute, no, I know I can turn. I'm going to approach this, relax, might tie some breathing exercises into it at the time to relax the physiology, and then actually turn. And the more that she turned, the more evidence that she had that she could turn. And so she was able to refute that particular type of thinking.
We're very good as dancers about preparing our bodies, but we don't necessarily prepare our minds. So have you got some exercises that you can suggest dancers do to prepare their minds as much as their bodies?
Look, definitely. I think it's all it's certainly all relevant to the context of what you're coming up to do. So whether that's at the moment for dancers returning into the studios again after being outside of the studio and managing for a long period of time, whether it's coming up to an exam for students or it's performances for professionals, there are a range of, I guess, techniques. So one of the first things might be, often when we're thinking about a key event that's happening, we probably already have, in my language again, we've already framed what that experience will be. And that's really interesting because if you've already pre-framed it as in you're fearful of it, you think that you're not going to do well at it, we often can create a self-fulfilling prophecy that ends up becoming true. So it's actually, the first step is actually being aware of, what are my thoughts and feelings about going back into the studio, or, being around my colleagues again, or, the performance that I do have coming up where I haven't performed in a year. What am I actually thinking about it already? Yeah, and so being conscious about that is the first step. So then you have that ability to identify, was that helpful or hindering to my goal of performing well or feeling comfortable or focusing upon, developing my technique further. So that ability to identify your thoughts, then look at how do I reframe them if they're not helpful, because guess what? That event hasn't even happened yet, but you're predetermining how your brain is actually influencing how you actually execute or dance in a class or a performance. So why don't you influence it in a helpful way? So actually taking the time to sit down and think and even write down what that is. Then you've got that ability to then pair it to things like mindfulness practice or breathing, knowing that often when we're the negative kind of self-talk, usually that's associated with anxiety or stress in some kind of way, or actually feeling quite down about something because you don't believe that you'll be able to do it. So that ability to actually control our breathing also is important in linking that with thinking in a different way, because then when you are coming into it, you go like, oh, hang on a minute, I know what I'm going to expect. I know kind of what my habitual brain was going to tell me about this, but actually I'm choosing to focus on thinking about it differently. And I need to actually focus on, again, my breath to break kind of the physiology, which is that anxiety link between when I get anxious, I breathe faster. It actually sends a signal to my brain to say, there's something here that I need to be stressed about. And then it dumps all the different type of, chemicals in our body that aren't helpful and get us stressed. So how do we actually pair those things? So there's the thinking aspect of it, and there's the link between the thinking and the physiology around it. But it's also, I'd encourage dancers to think, you know what a class is like. You know yourself, you know your body, you know where you're at in terms of your development or your return to the studio in that instance. How do you preempt what's likely to go on in your head in a hindering way, and actually think about, well, if that actually happens, actually I'm going to choose to think differently. I'm going to choose to focus on what I want to achieve. And also being, I think particularly for people returning to the studios after, kind of post-COVID, is being kind to themselves around and that expectation level. So let's be realistic about what we're expecting out of our first class or our first week or even our first month of being back.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure,
Gene.
Emma. Nice talking.